Hello, LinkedIn. Good afternoon. It's time for our next LinkedIn Live interview. Um, I'm really excited about my guest today. I feel that I always say it, but I'm always genuinely excited because I only invite people that not only I know will bring value to you and will, bring insight and, will be people that, you will remember their nuggets of wisdom. But I also only invite people that I genuinely, selfishly eager to talk to. So that's how I choose my guest. And today's guest is no different. Professor Carl Moore. I was telling him just now as we were chatting, preparing for this, that I have not had as many registrations for any of my LinkedIn Live interviews as I have for Professor Moore. So he said he feels special. I feel special vis-a-vis his his specialness. So to tell you about Professor Moore, if you don't know him yet, if you're not familiar with his work, he is one of the top 50 leadership and management thinkers in the world. Not in Montreal, not in Quebec, not in Canada, in the world. One of the top 50 leadership and management thinkers. I think that is mind-blowing. He's an associate professor at McGill University Business School. He's an Oxford grad. He has his own blog on Forbes.com. I'm sure you've seen him. He's very active on social media too, has a very strong personal brand on social media. He's on television all the time. He's also interviewed pretty much every CEO, and I know he's more factual than me, he's going to correct me on that, but he's pretty much interviewed every CEO you can imagine. And so you all know about the 6 degrees of separation, right? That we're all connected to everybody in the world through 6 degrees of separation. I truly feel that since I met Professor Moore, I'm 1 degree of separation because he literally knows everybody. Today, we're going to be talking, so he interviews CEOs, he writes a lot about leadership management, very different topics. But one of his core areas of research and interest is different personality types, introverts, extroverts, ambiverts, and the impact those different personality types have on leadership, how you present yourself as a leader, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, what that means, and also how you deal with your employees, depending on your personality type and theirs as well. So he has stories for days. I can't wait to pick his brain. For all of you that have tuned in, write down in comments below. Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? Are you an ambivert? Why? What makes you so sure if you're saying ambivert? Because that means you're not taking a single position. And also throughout this discussion, please ask questions. I'll make sure to ask as many of your questions as possible so that Professor Moore, so that we can pick his brain collectively and not just myself. So without further ado, Professor Moore, I hope you're ready because I'm bringing you up on the screen. You're always on camera though, you're always ready.
All right, Marina, great to talk to you. Carl, don't call me professor, that's fine. So I had a chance to talk at a conference for Marina and met her a number of times. So it's a real delight to be here with her, albeit in the same city, but some blocks apart. So if you could bring up the slides, please, Marina.
Absolutely.
So what I'm going to talk about today is introverts and extroverts. And I did this in business with Marina. I wrote a couple Forbes blogs last week, one about extroverts and one about introverts. And one got 14,000 views. So the other one about 4,000. So a lot of response to that was we're in lockdown. So what got me started is I wrote a Forbes blog reviewing Susan Cain's book Quiet about 6 years ago. And it got 60,000 views, 10 times normal. And I wrote it. So it wasn't the writing, it was the topic. So the next night in class, Claude Mongeau is the CEO of CN, about 24,000 people, big train company here in Canada, came to class. And I said, Claude, are you an introvert or extrovert? I'd never asked anyone that question before. And he said, absolutely introvert, and talked about it in a quiet way for about 10 minutes. The second guest, we have 2 guests in our CEO class at McGill for the MBAs, said he was an introvert. And this is quite astonishing compared to what I had thought about for years, not that I'd studied it, but kind of the back of my mind was that leaders are extroverts. And when I looked at the literature, it was all written by psychology professors about undergraduates, because professors like myself or psychology professor have an endless supply of undergrads we can test. And so it really had focused on people that were 20, 21 years old, where I was interested in the C-suite, senior leaders who were probably 20, 30 years older, so had been matured through life, but also were leaders at every step along the way. That's why they made it up to the C-suite. So that's what got me started in the studying this. So if the next slide, please. Oh, I can do the next slide. Sorry.
But can I also quickly ask you, because, when I announced this topic of discussion, I saw that quite a few people have different definitions of what it means to be an introvert and what it means to be an extrovert. Some people think it means you're antisocial. Some people think, if you were an introvert, you're shy. What are your definitions? What are we working with here as we're talking about the topic?
Well, the central definition from the literature and from a lot of studies is that where do you get energy from? So introverts love people, they're great being with people, but by being stimulated, their batteries wear down. So too much stimulation makes them have to recharge. So they go, enough of that. So they take what we call introvert breaks. So they go for a walk, they listen to Bach, they take their dog outside, things like that, where they have restorative niches, where they recharge themselves and they get back their energy back, charge their batteries, where they can get stimulation again. Well, now extroverts are the opposite in some ways. And they've done research looking at 4-month-old babies, Marina. So a 4-month-old baby doesn't talk, at least in our world anyway. Maybe where you're from they do, but most babies around the world don't talk. Well, you may have at 4 months, but so what they look at is their response as babies to stimulation. So that they looked at that and then followed them for decades. And it was a strong predictor at 4 months old if they're going to be an introvert or an extrovert. Not a perfect, but a strong predictor. So what it suggests is that it's hardwired to some degree. That the brain of an introvert is a little bit different than the brain of an extrovert. Both are great, but they respond to stimulation. And I see this when parents bring, new parents bring their baby to McGill. Some babies, most turn away to their mother or father's chest and hide themselves from me because I'm big and noisy and have a deep voice. Where some babies look towards me and go, wow, what's that? That's interesting. That's a strong predictor that they're going to be an extrovert introvert. So one of the key takeaways is this is the way I am. I was made that way. I'm over it. I don't feel guilty that I am made extrovert or introvert to some degree. But the title of my book that I'm reading with Stanford is We're All Ambiverts Now. Saying as a senior leader, you've got to act like the other on occasion to be an effective leader. So the central thing is your response to stimulation. Now, I read about introvert breaks, and I go, how come extroverts don't get breaks? Because there's nothing in the literature. And what I reflected and did some interviews and saw and wrote an article for the Wharton Leadership Digest about the 5 types of extrovert breaks. So let me give you an example. I'm sitting in my office at McGill writing a book for a couple hours, ironic about introverts. I can't take it anymore. Do you feel the pain in my voice? I really can't take it anymore. And what I need is stimulation. So I go down one floor where there's an endless supply of undergraduates, albeit I am giving them grades. They're happy to talk to me. And most have heard this lecture or some variation of it and go, extrovert break? So they tease me. And when I go to a restaurant without my wife and kids, I'll sit at the bar, talk to total, utter strangers because I want a stimulation. Now, it's something where, I'm an older man, I have a wedding band on. Once I say I'm a professor, I'm harmless. Everybody relaxes. But clearly, I'm not heading on them. This is the worst strategy in the world to have a wedding band, be older, and mention your wife and kids as you start the conversation. So they just relax. And it's very interesting stuff. Now, I got to tell you this story. I was in New York a couple months ago, and Bruce Willis is sitting right over there. And so this is being New York. Everybody's ignoring him, but taking selfies with him while they're ignoring him. But I talked to the people beside me because that's what you do. And I went down to talk to Bruce Willis, but we don't have time for that story. So what it is that the central... I
want that story. Can you tell me?
No, we don't have time. So some other time. But what we do is that it's about a response to stimulation. And extroverts need that stimulation. Introverts are great people, but they just get worn down. So we're two different kinds of people respond. Now, when I talk about it, it's a bell curve. Some people are very extroverted like myself. Some people are very introverted, but most people are kind of more in the middle where they're a bit extroverted, a bit introverted. They're not one or the other. So if I can get to, did I answer your question somewhat, Marina?
You absolutely did. And just one last question before you continue with the presentation. A lot of people do say, well, I'm an ambivert, myself included. When we first met, we went for breakfast. I told you, well, I'm an ambivert. And you said, oh, yeah, so many people say that. So few actually are. Are there percentages of, how many people are ambiverts?
Well, I've interviewed about 350 C-suite executives, so a fair sample size. And I learned the word ambivert about 6 months ago. It was invented in Toronto, so I'm very proud as a Canadian, in the 1920s. And it largely disappeared from the literature till Adam Grant Wharton, a rock star professor, about 10 years ago studied salespeople and saw ambiverts were the best. So it brought it back to the literature, but it's really the serious literature in the last almost 40 years has talked about ambivert. But it's a term which is getting some traction out there because it's an interesting idea. So an ambivert is, and so I found out this, I had a new toy. So the next 20 interviews of executives, I explained what an introvert, an ambivert, and extrovert was. So I was excited, as one could imagine. And every single one of the 20 said, I'm an ambivert.
Right, and because we don't want to be labeled as we want to be complex.
Well, right? It's also that, what I would argue that as an executive, they've got to act like an ambivert. That what an ambivert is someone who can act like an introvert at times and an extrovert at other times. So someone that can go both ways. Now, what I'm arguing, and the title of the book, remember, is We're All Ambiverts Now, is that if you want to be a senior leader, you've got to act like an ambivert, but you're not really.
So why is it important to act as an ambivert if you're a leader? Why?
As an effective leader for millennials and Zs, so I just finished a book on millennials and Zs, so I'm fairly wound up about it. But to be an effective leader in today's world, you've got to act like an introvert at times. So when I talk to CEOs, every single CEO that I've talked to hundreds now over the years, I have a CEO radio show, but I have a CEO class at McGill where we have CEOs come in 2 every Wednesday night. So I had hundreds come over the years. When David Benson runs Aldo, big shoe company, 17,000 people, David's 6'8", 300 pounds. He's not overweight. He's just big. And he's the CEO and the son of Aldo. So he's a big presence, literally and metaphorically. When he goes to a meeting, if he wants to have a real discussion, he doesn't give his ideas. Because if he comes in and says, here's what I'm thinking about the new strategy, everybody goes, David, I love it. That's why you're the boss. Maybe not quite that bad, but we're going to suck up a bit. So what he's learned is that he says, Marina, what do you think? Carl, what do you think? He goes around the room. Now, the good news, he's CEO. So at the end of it, he goes, okay, love your ideas, took some of yours, some of mine, created the strategy, and he gets to decide. So it's nice being a CEO. So CEOs know, and senior executives, that they've got to act like an introvert and not dominate because that's bad leadership. And it pretty ticks off Generation Z and millennials. So it's leadership in today's world. And from a viewpoint of strategy, so we have 2 big strategy schools in the world. Porter, who's at Harvard, and Mintzberg, who's at McGill. So we have deliberate and emergent strategy. So the Porter is the 5 forces, the 3 generic strategies, stuff I still teach on the MBA and the BCom, and it's great stuff. But it tends to be from the top down, and it assumes the CEO knows the world. Now, emergent strategy, which what I'm arguing is that love Porter, love his ideas, but the emergent approach is more how strategy is made in most industries today. Not all, but most. And the idea of emergent strategy is that ideas bubble up from the frontline troops who are dealing with actual customers in a turbulent environment. So the idea is this: if you're in a turbulent environment, you need to change inside the organization to align with the turbulent environment so you'll be successful. Now, how you do that emergent strategy, you let ideas bubble up, and ideas come from the troops who are actually dealing with that turbulent environment. And again, it's not one person, but a team working together. You probably have cross-functional teams, you have marketing, you have sales, operations, customer service. Ideas bubble up. The job of senior executive is not to have the ideas, but to recognize good ones when they slap them in the face and go, whoa. My job as a senior executive is resource those ideas and spread them across the organization. So that's emergent strategy, which means I've got to pay more attention to my boundary spanners. People have a foot in the organization and a foot with the customer, the turbulent environment, and listen to them more. Introverted behavior. Now, an introvert's got to get an extrovert, on the other hand, to be fair, to give that inspiring speech, to stir up the troops.
Right.
And so you need, as an executive, to act like an introvert and an extrovert, hence being an ambivert. But out of 350 people, I would say 40% were introverts, 40% on the bell curve were extroverts, about 20% were genuinely ambiverts. Because every executive said, I'm an ambivert, and it goes statistically unlikely. It's just not going to happen. So you and I have got to act like ambiverts, but I go, I'm an extrovert. I'm over it. It's my hard wiring since I was a baby born, and I need my extrovert break. So I think you need to be mentally sound is to take your introvert or extrovert breaks. Okay, one other thought here is that we have the idea of an ambivert break. So introverts get break. So no one in the literature talked about extrovert breaks. So I wrote a couple articles and I said, well, wait a minute. What do ambiverts do? So Marina, what do you think ambivert breaks are? Just to put you entirely on the spot here.
Well, depending on what's been happening. So as I had told you, I think that I'm an ambivert, although the social isolation is making me conclude that I am an extrovert because I'm struggling and I'm suffering and I'm constantly reaching out to people on video and connecting. But I know about myself that, let's say if I'm hosting a big event, big busy event, and there's a lot of social interaction, I do need to take my introvert breaks throughout because otherwise I'm going to crash after. If I'm having a lot of introvert time, let's say I'm weekend completely alone, I don't know, family's not around, I need to be squeezing in consciously extrovert breaks because otherwise I feel like I'm entering depression and not exaggerating. So I feel it's like a constant game of that.
I feel like a psychologist. I should stroke my beard after you've shared your emotions with us, Marina, but that's all. What it is that, exactly. So when you act like an extrovert, you need to take introvert breaks as an ambivert. When you act like an introvert, you need to take extrovert breaks. So you recharge yourself because enough of that introvert stuff, I need some energy from people. But it's something where an ambivert does that more naturally, where I rarely need an introvert break. So I take 40 students. Last year, went to Tokyo, Bangkok, and Hong Kong for 12 days. We come back to the Montreal airport and I go shake hands with everybody and thank them. And some of the introverts lean forward as we talk about and go, if I see another person in the next week, I'm going to scream. And I can feel the pain. Whereas an extreme extrovert, the next day, if you said, hey, we got to do it again, we missed something, yeah, that'd be great. Love it. And when I'm sitting in the lobby of the hotel in the morning, if I'm by myself, students come over very seriously and go, Carl, are you feeling all right? They assume I'm sick if I'm not out there schmoozing. So it's something where it's a bell curve. I'm kind of out here in the extreme. You're probably more a little bit introverted. But, in a case like this one where you're, at home, particularly when I talk to single people. So one of my students, her roommate moved back home, so she's by herself. Even her, more of an introvert, goes, it's enough. I have no human contact. And she went out for a walk along St. Catharines, didn't get too close, but just needed the energy of people. Mm-hmm. All right. So shall I move forward to the slides again?
Yes, just one question from our audience, and then we go back to the slides. Is there... Well, so right now leaders are really stepping it up as far as their communication with teams, daily communication, town halls. I mean, we're in times of crisis. And so do you feel that right now extroverted leaders are better positioned to be there to support their teams? That's question number one. Do introverted leaders really need to be leveraging their extrovert ability a lot more? What do you think right now should be something that leaders need to be mindful of?
Well, there's a range of things, depends on the industry, but from talking to a bunch of CEOs about what they're going through now, I interviewed a guy named Paul Tellier who ran the Canadian government, Bombardier, and CM, then Bombardier, and Dick Evans ran Alcan. So, and then a woman who was a managing director in the UK. They all co-taught my course, my CEO course. I know them well. And what they're saying is a lot of CEOs now are just running so hard because they've got to make decisions. They've got to get out there. Now, To make decisions, the extroverts tend to be better at making decisions, like quick decisions, sometimes too quick. That's the danger. But right now, a CEO can be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of time they have to be with people and encouraging people and listening to them. So in some ways, you got to be an introvert and listen to people's concerns. You also have to reflect their pain. Say, I'm talking, one of my former daughter students has 5 small kids. And it's just like, you go, the poor man. Our kids are at university, and so my problem is I had to ask them to leave the house or go away somewhere because I'm talking loudly for an hour, and that's all right. But it's something where I just cannot imagine 5 kids, small kids in a house. And the guy is going nuts, but he's being a good dad and a good husband, so fine. We appreciate it. So I think in a time like this, CEOs typically are called on to be there a lot. So they need their extroverted side, but they also need that introvert side of listening and saying, so what do you think we should do? And because the point the CEOs made was they've been through, Dick is in his 70s, Paul's 80, Emma's a bit younger, but they've been through a lot of crises. And what they said in a crisis, you need to make quick decisions, but you also need to listen, because almost everyone else in the room knows more than you do about their subject. Because if you're talking IT and your CIO's there, she knows more about IT than you do. And then you talk to a CFO, and he knows more than you do about finance. So the CEO, if the CIO shows up to fix my laptop and she has 500 people, I'm nervous she doesn't know what she's doing. It's been 10 years since she fixed the laptop, and exactly right. So something where a CEO's got to listen and being introvert and being that person of action and make decisions. So sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good. And one of the dangers of being an introvert is paralysis by analysis. And so that's the danger you can fall in now, is that just make a decision that's reasonable rather than dithering. And in a time of crisis, I think that dithering can be danger.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. I will let you continue, because otherwise I will keep bombarding you with questions nonstop.
Oh, it's more fun to have a conversation. But so here's a short test I'll ask everybody to take. And what it is 5 quick things. And 5 is that this is very much you, and 5, not you at all. And just come up with a number from 5 to 25. 5, it's all ones. 25, it's all 5s. So just take 30 seconds and I'll be quiet. So Marina, do you have a number?
I would say 20.
Okay, you're very much an extrovert. So if you're 20 to 25, you're an extrovert. If you're 15 to 20, more ambivert. And if you're 5 to 15, more introvert. Typically, this is a very short test, and many of you have done Myers-Briggs or the Big 5. I personally think, and the literature suggests, the Big 5 is better. But the Myers-Briggs I've done probably 3 or 4 times in my long career. And I've been fairly consistent, though it argues that as you get older, you may become a little bit less extroverted or a little less introverted, that you tend to be a little bit more towards the middle. So I've gone from maybe 25 to 23. So changed a bit, but in the seniors' home, I'm going to be very popular because I'll be the person talking to everyone.
Right.
Not just because I'm a nice guy, but because I'll be maybe your only visitor, Marina, but I will show up every day because I'm just can't take it anymore. So,
right.
You will go.
But can I ask you, where did you lose points over the years? Where did you go from 25 to 23? Which one's less?
Probably a little less talkative, because a great leader in today's world listens more. And so I have a bunch of people working for me, and I take 40 students and travel. And I've learned to listen more. So I have 2 students who've gone the year before that organize a trip. So I have 2 21-year-olds. In fact, they turned 21 when they work for me, work with me. And I say to them, as we plan a trip, we're going next year to Vietnam and Korea. It was canceled this year, so we'll go next year. I say to them, we have 3 votes. That you can outvote me, the 2 of you. Now, if Miguel has a rule, and I know, and I'll say, we all just salute Miguel rules and follow them. But I want them as 2 20-year-olds because they represent the students coming with me, to say, here's what we want. So they're allowed, and they do outvote me, where we have a conversation, but I have 2 20-year-olds that can outvote me. And that's because that's good leadership, and it's a better trip in this case, or better strategy, you could argue, in a bigger world. So it's evolving over time typically, but again, when I say typically, it's not everyone and it's not a set rule, it's more typically, okay? Now it's interesting that often, but not always, a fair bit, you marry your opposite. In terms of an extrovert may marry an introvert. Now, two introverts can probably get along quite well because they're both just quiet, and that's fine. Two extroverts can drive each other crazy. So I've mentored lately a woman called Melanie Joly, who's a minister in the government, and knew her before she gone into politics. And we have had total strangers come up to us in coffee shops and say, "Are you guys all right?" Because Melanie are both extreme extroverts. We talk over each other, and it's great fun. We love it. We get energy. But after an hour, I'm thinking, and I said this to Mel up at Parliament. I ran into her and I said, "Mel, I tell students that after an hour, I'm thinking, does she ever shut up?" And she said, "I'm thinking the exact same thought, Carl. Does he ever shut up?" So there's something where it can be too much sometimes.
Right.
So Marina, I shouldn't ask, but what's your husband?
Definitely. Can I just quickly go 2, 4, 5? Yeah, like the complete opposite.
Oh, no.
And especially my parents come to mind because right now, my father is just in the happiest time of his life, knowing nobody's going to show up at his house for a while. And my mother is literally climbing walls and doesn't know what else to do. So it's interesting. Yeah, the opposites.
You often do that, but not always. So if it's two introverts or extroverts, it's all good. You can make a relationship work, but it just typically. So these are typical things, but they're not always true. Again, there's a famous saying that if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And what it means is that, so I was fixing the back fence in our backyard here, and I was putting in screws with a hammer. So an older neighbor comes by and goes, "Carl, that's wrong, almost morally wrong." And it meant like the screw does a better job of fastening if you screw it in. If you hammer, it's doing violence to the screw. Now it's metal. I don't think the screw generally actually cares. But the point is that you need to have a bunch of tools. So when I think about human beings, I might say, well, Marina's an extroverted millennial woman, which is all true. But if you ask your husband or your kids or your parents, they'd go, Marina's much more complex and interesting than that. So when we talk about introversion, extroversion, ambiversion, it's one way of looking at people, but don't wear that hat too long. Because it only tells one thin slice of someone, but it can be helpful. So let me move to the next slide now that I figured how to do this, I think. So it brings up the idea of ambiverts, which we've talked about a bit, but it may be new to some of the people listening, is that ambiverts are people, as we've talked about, can act like extroverts at times and introvert other times. They take ambivert breaks, and we need to be like them. So two key dimensions from a leadership viewpoint. One side is stimulation. So extroverts like excitement. They like stimulation. We seek it out. Introverts prefer calm. They don't like as much. Marina, are you still there? So they like the calm, not as much stimulation. So this is the central construct that differentiates the two. So the danger on both sides is that extroverts good at making decisions, but they might make snap decisions that get you in trouble. That's the danger of the extrovert. They just like the excitement. They like have multiple balls in the air, but they might drop a ball. Now the introvert, paralysis by analysis, that they never get to making a decision. So there's strengths and weaknesses on both sides. The other dimension on the bottom is action to deliberation, we've touched on. So these are two key dimensions that make a difference between those three. And you're probably not an ambivert, but maybe you are, but I would say it's 20% of people, roughly, and I'm waving my hands because, I've interviewed 350, but it's not every culture, every person in the world, yada, 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 okay? So getting on to our next slide here, some of the key characteristics. Introverts like to focus on one thing at a time. Extroverts like multitasking, multiple balls in the air, and it's around stimulation. It's more stimulating.
Right.
Introverts prefer to listen than take stage because they want to analyze it, connect the dots before they make a decision. So they more want to think about it, where the extroverts seek the spotlight. I have no problem going on a stage in front of thousands of people and talking if I know what I'm talking about, generally. So when you think about it, how you manage an introvert is that you let them thing. So if I have when I have meetings with introverts that work with me, I'll look at them and just kind of just look at them, and I'm asking, are you ready to say something? And they might go, they'll just nod a little bit. If they say no, I ain't going to call them. It's just not going to happen because they'll be upset, rightly so. Now, an extrovert like you, Marina, I don't have to call on because you're much like a dog, ready to go.
I have been the whole time, right?
Yeah, it's hard to hold back. But it's great because I love it, because it's something where I love that energy. So in a meeting, I can just say, hey, Marina, what do you think? And I know it'll be funny and charming and there'll be an idea in there. Now, the introvert, when I call them, we kind of go, he's talking. They don't say a lot, but when they do, it's well thought out. So in French, now it's interesting because in French, I don't speak it well, but when I speak, people go quiet. Keep up. You know, it's unbelievable. But I think it through. So I'm actually an introvert in French. Okay. One other thought here, there's a cultural overlay to this as well. So I teach in Reykjavik University in Iceland, and my mother's Finnish. So the Finns are famous and the Icelanders for being introverts. In fact, I will tell you the one introvert joke I know. Can I tell you a joke, Marina?
Yes, please.
So how do you tell a Finnish introvert from a Finnish extrovert? A Finnish introvert looks at his shoes when he's talking to you. A Finnish extrovert looks at your shoes. So it's something where you're supposed to laugh at this point. But anyway, so that's better. So
I have to tell you, Professor Carl, I have a lot of strengths, but everybody who knows me knows sense of humor is really not one of them. I'm the worst. And it's also one, you know, I'm an immigrant, right? So English is far from being my first language. So there's always with any joke, whether I'm trying to make it, I'm receiving it, there's like a long delay.
That's fine. So what it is saying is that there's a cultural overlay. So when I teach at Reykjavik University, when I say, are there any questions, there's a pause because they're thinking about it. When I go to New York, you take a breath, someone else jumps in. Where New York is that kind of place where it's more that style, where in Iceland, again, it's small population, 340,000 or something in the whole country, where it's a cultural thing. So when I took my students to Japan and then to Bangkok last year, Thailand, what we observed was, and there's some literature supporting this, is that Japan's more introverted as a culture, where Thailand is less introverted. So that what you see is a culture, there's an equal number of introverts and extroverts, but in Japan, it's more to the introvert side, Thailand more the extrovert side. So I have three personalities. So again, this is not a psychological issue, I don't think, but I grew up in Canada, lived 6 years in the States, LA and Boston, so on the coast, and then lived 5 years in England. So when I go to England, I get a British accent because they made fun of me so much, and I'm more sarcastic and I'm quieter. When I go to the US, I actually become noisier, more extroverted, believe it or not. So I adjust my personality to the culture I am in to some degree. So culture matters.
But so intentionally, or do you feel it just, you catch yourself doing that?
Well, now I do it intentionally. But when I went to England, I learned to get a British accent because they made fun of me, and learn to be quieter because that's the way the culture is. So, I mean, what's the culture you grew up in, Marina?
Well, I was born in the Soviet Union and then grew up in Ukraine.
So something where you look at Ukraine versus Quebec, but even within Quebec, you have English versus French culture. So the French tends to be a bit noisier, more gestures. That's partly a function of language, but it's cultural as well. So I lived in Saskatchewan. Again, a bit quieter, more introverted society on average, though there are noisy people in Regina. So you have in Iceland, there are some extroverts, but they're more rare and they tend to calm down because of the culture. So there's a cultural overlay to all this. Okay. And a final thought is that, well, not a final thought, but a thought, is that certain functions tend to draw certain kinds of people, like auditors and accountants tend to be a bit quieter, a bit more introverted. For salespeople tend to be more extroverted, though it helps to be the introverted salesperson. A great salesperson listens more than they talk. That's hard for an extrovert. And the extroverted AI person can be really valuable in a bunch of introverts. I'm on the board of a small AI company, and our AI programmers they tend to be introverts, leave them alone to make us a lot of money. But one of those who's also extroverted can be a great salesperson and a great bridge between the customers and the AI programmers. Okay,
Mhm.
so let me finish up here a little bit. Recharge and quiet, as we talked about recharging, and introverts prefer to avoid conflict. Extroverts don't mind it because it's stimulating. Okay, so again, ambiverts are in the middle of it here. Let me just flip. So just want to reflect a bit on the current circumstance we're in. And I
Right.
wrote a Forbes blog this last week with one of my former students. She's 25 now. Kat lives in New York, works for a Boston Consulting Group. We're both extroverts, so we're commiserating, wrote this article. I can't take it anymore. How to cope with the lockdown as an extrovert. And so came up with some points. Here we are. So these are the 5 points, Marina. So let me just go through them, and then we did a piece on introverts. So one is to keep your cadence, that you can't just collapse, but you got to keep, as an extrovert, Zoom calls, you got to keep touching people, go for walks, talk to your strangers neighbors from a safe distance. So I scotch with a couple guys, one at a time, where they just hand me a glass of scotch and we talk from 10 feet apart. And so, and get that
I
stimulation.
like that idea.
So, tapping into your entrepreneurial spirit, where you're going out there doing some more interesting stuff that gets you stimulated. Keep a social calendar, so you might have drinks or dinner with other people on Zoom or Skype or whatever. Real sense of community helps an extrovert, particularly because you want to feel that you're connected and that you get that stimulation. So those are some of the points. Now, I wrote one with Henry Mintzberg, who's our most famous prof by far, his daughter Lisa, who's an introvert living in England, and she went on Facebook back and forth, and we wrote an article about the introvert side. It's a little less difficult for an introvert in the lockdown because you don't mind that lack of stimulation.
Right.
But at a certain point, it may kind of go, even for an introvert, it's enough. So in this time, we kind of see that there's a different response. Okay, one last thought, and then I'll take some questions if there's any out there, if anybody's left. I interviewed Claude Mongeau. So ran CN, 24,000 people, McGill grad, and he had a coach when he was COO. So he's COO, the number 2, and they're thinking about him for CEO, so he gave him a coach. And one of the things he did was to help him act like an extrovert. So he gave him a clicker 5 times a day. He had to click it and act like an extrovert. Let me give an example. So he gets in the elevator in the morning, and instead of looking at his feet as a good introvert and saving us $100,000 in the 6th floor ride on CN down here in the Le Gauchetière, he should say, Marina. So he knows your name. He goes, good morning. And says something like, oh, a nice day or tough weather, whatever. It's something I'm not going to argue with. Then he's got to go, Marina, great presentation last week. I appreciate your insight and your ideas. Thanks very much. Get off the elevator. Because that's good leadership behavior. Albeit it wasn't natural for him as an introvert. It was good behavior that he really appreciated. So I think I covered a lot of the bases I want to talk about. Do we have any questions? Or Marina, you have questions always. I'm going to sit down.
Always.
All right.
So one of our viewers, Marie-Claude Dupont, asked how extroverts and introverts can overcome the current crisis in positive ways, and I guess keep the positivity. You've alluded to that. I'm also curious to, add to the question a bit. What can we do as leaders? Because I'm finding that now what companies are doing to sustain communication with employees is all the same across the board. We see all those pictures on LinkedIn of everybody on Zoom together, and a lot of, social Zooms and team building. But what would be a more effective way for, you've talked about how extroverts and introverts can manage better at this time. What can we do as leaders to help them?
I think leadership is, I don't know what level you are, but senior leadership from CEOs is people, and I've interviewed a bunch of people and read some literature on it, saying is that you got to keep calm. So as an extrovert, don't get carried away, because what we don't want is a panicked executive, but someone who's going to go, I understand this is unique in our history. And I interviewed Paul and Dick, Henry Mintzberg-Goel, who's 80, and Emma, who's a bit younger. And in their long lives as senior executives, they'd never seen anything like this. But I think we have to go back to World War II to men and women who fought. And there are essentially no soldiers who were actually fighting or were officers alive. So in terms of living memory, this is it. And so what we need is someone who is calm. We're going to work this out. There's a video from Kaylin Revanesco, who's the CEO of Air Canada, that came into my box last night, sent out to many, many of the customers. And again, he came across as someone knows what he's doing. He's in charge. Also, I think you have to be authentic. And part of it, I mean, it's interesting with the Zoom, you have more authenticity in the sense that I see pictures in your background and I see your stares. And so I'm doing yoga with one of our McGill people, and his dog goes wandering by. And part of it is that we're actually getting to know people a little bit better because we're in their homes. Now, Zoom has a background that you can put behind you. So I had to do some things in my laundry room because it was bothering my wife and kids. So I didn't want to have the laundry room. So I put a thing there. But, you know, there's a sense. I did a thing for McGill alumni in Paris on the weekend where I started out in the front porch and said, because they're all McGill alumni in Paris, I said, there's snow on the ground, which they memories of Montreal. But I said, I pointed at a tree with the camera, said, but there's buds on the tree, so spring's coming. And the park across the way, which has a bunch of things for small kids, is taped off. So we're part of the lockdown as well. So I think that kind of sharing a bit more is happening, and it makes people more real and authentic. So I think a third point is, now this is an extrovert thing. See, I don't have 3 points, but I have 2. But I am confident I will think of the third. If I was in the classroom, I would say, in groups 3, discuss what should my third point be. You guys reverse mentor me. Now, Marina, you might call me over and go, you don't have an idea, do you? We both laugh. But an introvert is horrified by the thought of saying there's 3 things you should know, and you only know 2. But as an extreme extrovert, I'm fairly confident I'll come up with a third point
right.
in the conversation, but I can always turn it over to the audience. So I think those are a couple of things that strike me from talk to senior people who have been there and done it. And the third point would be draw, and as we've talked about, your people, their knowledge, their insights, their wisdom, their advice. Don't be afraid to make a decision, but listen before you make a decision.
Very interesting. I love it. I'm loving all of it. So another one of our viewers is Allison Cordner, who seems to be an extrovert in big need of socialization. She's leaving so many comments. She's really participating. Thank you, Allison. And so one of the things she said is, should I be dating introverts or will I find them dull?
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of, the danger of extroverts is that they may just want too much attention and want to be the center of attention. And as an extrovert, you tend to want that, and that's fine. Where an introvert is saying, that's great, I don't care, that's fine. But it's something where the challenge might be, do you get the energy from them? Would be maybe someone who's too introverted might not be the best thing. So, but also 2 extroverts can get in the relationship with 2 introverts, but it just tends to be because an extrovert would appreciate the introvert who thinks a bit more, maybe gets so any husband knows if his wife kicks him under the table at a dinner, he should instantly be quiet. And she will explain on the way home how he is screwing up. But so if your wife kicks you, you just stop what you're doing right there. You screwed up, and she will explain. Where a man shouldn't kick his wife just because it's wrong. But something where it tends to be the woman that goes, oh man. Introverts are good at that as well. Marina, do you ever occasionally tap your husband and tell him later what's wrong?
I don't kick, but I make
well, you just tap him gently, but
he
knows that stop.
Right.
But I think it tends to be something where if you have an extreme introvert, it might be too much for you. So that's my marital advice for today.
Interesting. You're giving all sorts of advice. You are a therapist today. Another question. So from the audience. So you said that as a leader, you need to be able to put your extrovert face on if you're an introvert and vice versa. And then the question is, well, then are you not being fully authentic as a leader if you are putting on sort of a facade at times?
Well, when you say it that way, yeah. But, and one of the things we need with my book on Millennials and Generation Z is saying authenticity in terms of leadership. When I worked at IBM, we had 9 months training, 30 years ago to become an IBMer. And, we had white shirts, red ties, blue suits, female equivalent. and you could roll me out and roll you in, and no one could tell the difference. You were kind of the corporate person. Where today, what we want in a leadership is someone that is a human being that has frustrations, is imperfect, and recognizes it. But I think what I'm talking about is being an adult, one could argue. So I wrote an article with one of my students, MBA grad, who was getting married. And she's very much an introvert and said, I'm worried about getting married as an introvert. And what she meant was the wedding. So she said, the worst idea is that you walk in the church, hundreds of people rise and stare at you. And so you could elope, but her parents and his parents weren't for that. And her husband didn't want to elope, and that's fine. But you can elope. But what they said is that there's ways of designing a wedding where as the woman, particularly, you're going to be the center of attention, to deal with it and make it like you could have the wedding reception where it's a table higher up where it's you and your husband. If you're not close to him, you're in deep trouble starting your marriage. And you have your sister as your maid of honor. So the two most comfortable people in the world for you. And you have a pie, you don't talk to people. And you dance with your father and your husband, and that's it. So there's ways of dealing with it. But she said, she interviewed many, many women who had got married, and she said, to a woman, they said, the introverts, when they came in the church or the synagogue, they only had eyes for their husband-to-be, who's going to be their husband in 3 minutes, and no one else mattered, which is all very romantic and charming, but as an introvert, it didn't bother them. So there's something where I think you can act a part as a leader. So as an extrovert, if I listen, it's good for my soul, it's the right thing to do, and I think I can do it authentically. Though you're right that you can maybe push it too far.
Interesting. I love that your advice applies to all areas of our lives and not just.
As an expert, you think about how do you approach things, and so naturally it comes across that way, I guess.
I love it. Another question from the audience: how do you learn to, go from being but exhibiting introvert behavior versus extrovert, depending on situation? That question comes from Stéphane Boisvert. And also, how do we train people to do that? What are some of the tools? Are there books? Are there trainings? How do we do that? I know that with your students, you do it by immersing them in situations. I was reading your article about you taking your students to spend 2 days with Warren Buffett and observe him because he's an introvert. And I mean, there is no better way to learn than from one of the top leaders in the world and being immersed. But we're not all your students, and we don't get the opportunity to do that. So what are some of the tools?
Well, something you might get if you have a management coach or something, someone that can advise you on that. So again, this is just one hat that you put on to think about who you are. You're also a woman or a man. You're also a certain age, a generation, and so on. But it's something, if you're aware of this and go, look, I'm an introvert. I recognize in this context, I need to up my game a little bit. And partly is watching extroverts and how they handle it. And someone who's an extrovert, how does he or she handle the circumstance? And let me emulate their behavior. So in my CEO class, one of the questions I asked them, was they've not all been CEOs since birth, is it different being CEO? And to a person, they go, absolutely. And some were COO, where they ran the company and they worked closely with the CEO. So you think, how could you not know him? And they knew some of it, but it's a different role that you've got to deal with stakeholders, you've got to deal with government, you've got to go to annual meetings, you've got to talk to the media, and it's a different set of things you don't do typically as COO. So by watching that person do it and watching an extrovert how they do it, you can learn as an introvert some of the type of behavior. Or as an extrovert, watch introverts and say, in this case, I would have said something, and they just sat back and went, tell me more. So that we can learn from the other as someone who's good at what they do, and it can be quite helpful, I think.
And is it important to take those different personality types into account when we're building teams? Do you advise that companies do that as well, or it doesn't matter because we can adapt to situations if we're properly trained?
What's interesting is a big movement in the world of corporations is diversity in government as well. And so I've been talking to PSP, to Deloitte. I was down to see Oliver Wyman down in New York. So diversity, we focus mainly on gender and race, rightly because there's been discrimination. And it's also partly when I look at race and discrimination and gender, like you're a white woman, Marina, and you self-identify. You have long hair. I'm just jealous you have hair, but you know, clearly the way you are. And I've never had a student at Oxford, Cambridge, or McGill that didn't self-identify by gender. Now, maybe someone's had a gender change and so on, but by and large, we identify. I'm bald, so that clarifies it just very clearly. But and race, now I'm very white, you're white. Now there's some people might have a black and white parent, but we can tell. What I like about introversion and extroversion, so I'm trying to add that to the diversity argument, is I can't look at you and go, you're an introvert or you're an extrovert. I need to get to know you as a human being.
Right.
So as a manager, I need to get to know people. And so one of the things they do at BCG and McKinsey, two of the top consulting firms, is that they often, at the beginning of a new team where they're working on a consulting project, go, what are you, Marina? Are you an introvert or extrovert, an ambivert? And we discuss it. So I'm aware, okay, Marina said she's an extrovert. Therefore, knowing her typical strengths, I'll treat her a certain way. And we might be at the hotel, we've worked late at night, and I might say, hey, Marina, do you want to grab some dinner with us as a group? But if you're an introvert, you might go, I'll ask her just to be polite, but I know she wants to go back to the room and take an hour-long introvert break. So I'm more sensitive to the other to lean into what they need. But I also have self needs, and I go, love you guys, but I need to go back and watch Netflix because I just need to recharge. And if we accept that this is the way we're hardwired, God made us that way, if you would, we're more relaxed about it. So we see companies that are learning about it and saying, from a diversity viewpoint, if I have a bunch of extroverts, it's not going to go well. I need introverts and extroverts in the way that I prefer a team that has men and women, that has different races and has, but this has always been true at IBM. New products was we wanted marketing, sales, service people, production people. Now, back then, the production people had overalls on, so we could tell who they were, and salespeople tend to be noisier, but I couldn't just look at them and know, but I wanted that diversity of thought. So, but I'm trying to add the idea of introversion and extroversion as a level of diversity that we add to gender and race as one that we should take on board when we think about a team.
To have more complex teams. Very interesting.
Well, we have stronger, we have better thinking because the introvert's going to sit and think and connect the dots in a way that I won't. On the other hand, I'll bring energy and just do it and make a decision that they won't. So together, we're a better team.
Interesting. Yes, and cover each other's blind spots and also learn from each other, as you said. Another question from the audience. So you talked about the study that was done to predict, just based on babies' behavior, whether they were extroverted or introverted. I'd never thought of it that way, but now that I'm thinking of what my kids were like as babies, and now they're a bit older, and I'm clearly seeing their personality, yeah, I could have predicted had I known that those were the signs. But so a question from audience is, what role does childhood have? I mean, you mentioned that it's nature, but is it also nurture when it comes to bringing out introvert or extrovert sides of one's personality?
Sure. I mean, we can work with our kids to encourage them to go meet people, to be more outgoing and friendly, to work a crowd in the right way. You know, there's a time to go and in a high school to schmooze your teacher, talk to the principal in a respectful way. And students like, know that they'll come and talk to me because it won't affect their grade. Because how I grade, I don't look at who wrote it. I just grade it and then go, oh, it was Susan, But it's something where they can build a connection and learn to build connections as introverts. So I think you can teach your children that way. But I think it's something where there's kind of a natural part. And if we recognize that introverts and extroverts and ambiverts all have strengths and they're all good, we can calm down and go, so my kid's an extrovert. There's some negatives to that. There's some positives, but it is the way they are. It's all right. Now, but you have to act like an adult. So there's a time when, probably around grade 3 or 4, that you lose your name as a parent. You're no longer Marina, you're Eric's mother. And you go, in that context, they're more important than you are. And if you go to your husband's work, they know him, but they don't know you. So as a parent, as a spouse, you step back and let the other person be the center of attention. That may be slightly harder for extrovert, but it's called being a grown-up. That, you see dads, I think only dads do this. They're playing, soccer with a 7 or 8-year-old, and they don't let them score. And you go, we're not impressed. You're 45 and you can beat a 7-year-old. We're not.
That's me. That's so me, though.
No,
Yeah.
but that's overly competitive, and you need to grow up. Let them score. Now, there's a certain point, Marina, your daughter will let you win at tennis after you let her win for years. So she'll be, and you go, honey, are you letting me win? And she'll go, yeah. And you go, oh, the world's changed. I now have to work to beat my kids. Where when they're small, you let them score because if you just never let them score, it's bad parenting to a small child, right, Marina?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's something where, as we get older and as a leader, we got to take on certain roles, but that just be called be an adult. You step back and let someone else be the center of attention because that's the right thing to do. Your husband's work, not yours. If you have to demand you're the center of attention, it's a bit sad. But on the other hand, in other contexts, you can be the center of attention. It's all good.
Right. But you know, it's true. But we do, I believe, I do have the tendency. So my daughter is an introvert. My son is an extrovert. I do try to push her to be more of an extrovert because society rewards extroverts in many ways. So, you know, it's interesting when you said that when you speak in French, you're more of an introvert, because that really resonates with me when I came to Canada. And I was a student at McGill. My English was rough. I had an extremely thick accent. Nobody could understand what I was saying. So as a result, I was pretty introverted and massively insecure and wouldn't speak up in class. And I could see firsthand how professors favored the extroverted, loud, very confident students. And I kind of like sat there in my corner, feeling more insecure
Well,
with every passing day.
not to rub it in, Marina, that was a few years ago. We're taking it more on board in education that we need to make room for the introverts. We actually have these conversations about how do we. So I was invited to Harvard Business School last year to give a talk to a couple hundred MBAs and some faculty and administration. As they said at Harvard, a woman from Career Services, about 60% of their MBAs are introverts. And at Harvard, it's 800 cases. All they do every class, 2 classes, 3 classes a day is cases.
Right.
Where the professor goes, Marina, can you open the case? And for 10 minutes, you explain what the leader in the case should do. And then for the next 80 minutes, our job as the other students, the other 89 students out of 90, is to jump on and show what's wrong. So an extrovert will just throw up there. I thrown up my hand when I was at Harvard without knowing what I was going to say. An introvert would go, you're nuts. But the problem with introverts is they have great ideas, but they don't say anything. And at the end of 90 minutes, they have stunning ideas, but they don't get good grades because they didn't say it. So we have to encourage introverts, and we have some things that we can do online now. But I say to the introverts, you've read the case. You're smart. I'm going to call on you, Marina. I'm going to call on you. I'll look at you. And unless you go, no, I'm going to call on you. And whatever you say, I'll go, that's interesting. I won't tease you. I won't make fun of you, no matter what you say, because I want you to speak. So we encourage introverts to speak up. So I think you're doing good parenting by encouraging that, where I think we're more aware of the strengths of introverts, but at times, like if you go to a event that's networking and you don't talk to anyone, that's not good networking. And you probably never get married if you don't talk to someone. Like there's a point where you need that to go out there and network and say hello to the Royal Bank to get a job there. And up your personality a bit to do well. Now, on the other hand, maybe you should be an AI programmer and just program and be by yourself. So you might draw to a profession or function which more fits with you. But I think we need to have a little bit of flexibility in our personalities to go forward and to be effective. I think it's something we need to do. But there's limits to how much I'm going to flex. And that's all right.
Right.
At a certain point.
I think, and it's very reassuring that you're saying that at the, university levels, those conversations are being had, and that you're looking at ways of encouraging students that are introverted as well, because that's one of the things with my daughter's elementary school. She's an exceptional student, she's independent, she's great, but the teachers keep telling me, she doesn't speak up in class unless she's called upon. She's great with presentations, but she will just sit there unless she knows that it's her turn to speak. And I say, but what's wrong with that? that. That's her personality. That's fine. I mean, she does do presentations. We've worked on that. Why does she need to be the loud one? We want her to be louder in class, and I'm wondering why. So it's.
We have 10 seconds left. So one final thought. Love you, introverts. Love my fellow extroverts. It's the way you were made. Relax and enjoy life.
Thank you. I'll pass that message on to my daughter's teachers.
All right. Nice
Thank
chatting.
you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Talk to you later. Bye.